This past summer, I went home to Texas like I do almost every summer. And like every trip home, this summer I made a point of spending Shabbat with the congregation my family has been a part of since I was a child. This summer, like every summer since my ordination, the rabbi there gave me a little shout out from the bima at the start of the service. He usually says something along the lines of, "We are honored to have another rabbi in the room this evening," or "We welcome Rabbi Schaller tonight." Sometimes he reminds people that I'm not just Rabbi Schaller, but I'm also Bernice and David's daughter. But this particular Friday night, it was a simple welcome to Rabbi Schaller. And this summer, like every summer, when he introduced me, I gave an awkward nod and smile to the congregation. And like I do every summer, I enjoyed spending the rest of my evening in prayers that someone else had to lead. This summer, after the service concluded, as we were all filing out to the social hall, a friendly member of the congregation tapped on my father's shoulder and said to him, "Rabbi Schaller, what brings you to the Woodlands?" My dad quickly responded, "Actually, I'm not the rabbi, my daughter is." And he nodded towards me as I struggled a friendly wave while keeping a hold of the toddler with his sights set on oneg cake. This summer, after his mistake, the well-meaning, friendly congregant who hadn't recognized my dad from other congregational events awkwardly apologized and moved on in the line. I know that he was embarrassed, but I don't blame him for making that kind of mistake. It neither offended me or hurt my feelings in any way, not only because that kind of thing happens to me fairly often. It's not so strange that my dad would be pegged for the rabbi and I wouldn't, because I know I don't look particularly rabbinic. And I know this because when I close my own eyes and picture a rabbi, when I imagine the most rabbinical rabbi that ever stood on a bima, the image that pops up for me is friend and relative of many people in this room, Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Emmanuel of Denver, Rabbi Steve Foster. He was my grandparents' rabbi when I was a kid. And when I picture this rabbi, I picture Steve Foster, circa mid-90s, with Heschel's beard and pointy glasses. Steve Foster and Abraham Joshua Heschel. That's my idea of a rabbi. How about you? Close your eyes for a minute. Imagine the most rabbinic rabbi that ever rabbied. Imagine how wise that rabbi is, how knowledgeable. Imagine a rabbi you would go to for advice, for comfort, for spirituality. What does this rabbi look like for most of us? Probably a cross between a rabbi you knew once and maybe a famous person you admire. Is your rabbi a man with a deep, booming voice? Is your rabbi in their 50s or 60s? You know, old enough to be experienced, but still with it? Does your rabbi have a beard, a little graying or white hair? Well, I'm sure there are a few people out there who genuinely think of a woman first. I'm betting there are very few people in this congregation tonight who didn't picture a person with white skin. I am a woman and an outspoken feminist. I, more than most, truly know the diversity of the Jewish community and the need to represent that diversity. The first rabbi I remember leading my childhood congregation was a woman. One of my best friends from rabbinical school is a young woman of color. I know rabbis with black skin and transgender identities, and yet I close my eyes, and the first picture of rabbinic authority that I come up with is a just past middle-aged white man with a gray beard. Do you know the word for missing the mark or intention, for making a mistake or acting out of accordance with our values or intentions? At this time of year, it's often at the tip of our tongues. In Hebrew, it's chet. In English, we translate it to mean sin. And this evening, before we get to our traditional confession, the vidui and the al-chet, our communal acknowledgement of our sins, I admit that this is one of mine. Well, you might be thinking, it may be cliche, and it may not match those feminist values you're always espousing, but is it really a sin? I know you. You're not a racist or a misogynist. You're not homophobic or transphobic. You're no kind of phobic. Your best rabbi friend is a woman of color after all. And I bet at least some of you are thinking towards me, you are my rabbi. You are a good person. And again, I know you might be tempted to respond to my confession this way because I've heard myself and others I love and respect say things just like this. And that is exactly why it's such a big deal. A few years ago, a friend and I were having coffee on a Monday morning. My friend is a black woman, a mother, and an accomplished journalist. Our sons were that delicious age, somewhere right between baby and toddler, and they were wobbling around after each other in the mostly empty coffee shop. An acquaintance of mine came in. This acquaintance spent many years teaching at a struggling inner-city school. She believes in equality and justice for all. She very intentionally votes for candidates that she believes will address racism and socioeconomic inequality. She actively speaks out against racism. And more than all this, she is a person that I know makes every effort to do right by others however she can. She sat down with us and we all started schmoozing. And at one point she asked my friend, "Where do you work?" "Mostly at my desk," my friend replied with a chuckle. And then after a breath, she explained that she was a journalist, and she listed several of the more prestigious places one might have seen her byline. The next day, my friend asked me if I had noticed that question, and I will admit I had not. She asked me if I thought there was a difference between where do you work and what do you do for a living. And again, I admit I didn't really see a big difference until she explained to me that what you do presumes a career, an occupation that you're proud of. It presumes that you have a response that other people will respect. You ask, "What do you do?" expecting a professional answer. What do you do? "Oh, I own a small business. I'm a journalist, a pediatrician, a teacher." But where do you work is subtly very different. Where you work emphasizes the place over the occupation. Where do you work presumes that you have a job, not a career. The answer to where you work is not "I manage" or "I create" or "I save lives." The answer to where you work is simply a location. And the acquaintance who asked this question, she certainly didn't mean anything by it. She wasn't trying to be rude or condescending. She was trying to be social and polite. She was genuinely curious about my friend, and I'm sure she thought she asked a simple question. And my friend, she wasn't offended by the question. She didn't harbor a grudge against the woman. She didn't accuse her of being a racist. And there might not have been a long-lasting impact from that one question. But I'll tell you this. As a rabbi who doesn't look like a rabbi, I know this kind of thing never happens just once. And when it happens in different ways over and over again, it certainly does have an impact. My skin is white, and I can never fully know what it's like to be a woman of color in this world, but I do know, as a rabbi who doesn't particularly look like a rabbi, that when enough people comment on your outfit rather than your sermon, you start worrying less about what you say and more about what you wear, and eventually you begin to wonder if you actually have anything worth saying. And I know, as a rabbi who doesn't look like a rabbi, that when enough people seem ever so slightly surprised that you know what you're talking about, that you're thoughtful and knowledgeable, and dare I say wise, you start to wonder if you actually are any of those things. And I know, as a rabbi who doesn't look like the picture most of us have in their minds when they picture a rabbi, that when someone doesn't count you for a minion, you start to feel like you might not count as a person at all. I experience what we sometimes call microaggressions, sometimes full-on aggressive aggressions, because I'm a woman in a field that is dominated by men. I know what it feels like to face that type of subtle slight, and yet I still didn't notice when it happened to my friend because of the color of her skin. She had to point it out for me to see. I can genuinely plead ignorance, but it doesn't absolve me. Because what I don't know can't hurt me, but what I don't know may certainly hurt others. In this room, I know I'd be preaching to the choir to say that we as Jews need to stand up against racism and classism and against homophobia. I know that you all agree with me when I say it's important to fight for equality for women and for those who don't fit neatly within the gender binary. We are Reformed Jews, after all. We were on the front lines of the civil rights movement, the first to ordain women. We were the first to openly hire a lesbian rabbi to lead a non-LGBT congregation. We believe that people are B'Tselem Elohim. We were all created in the image of God and thus deserve equal rights and opportunities. It is a core value for all of us. And I know that equality for all is an easy statement for everyone in this room to make. But how would it feel for you to admit that you yourself carry implicit biases about people based on class and race and gender and sexuality, and those biases might even impact how you treat them? Most of us wouldn't have any issue at all admitting that we sometimes make assumptions about other Jewish people, assuming that the guy with the nose and the glasses eating the pastrami on rye at Benji's, assuming that that guy would appreciate a hearty Shana Tova, not such a big deal. Assuming the lady on the park bench asking a million questions about your kid like a yenta is actually a yenta. It's not hard to admit that most of us do that kind of thing. But to admit that we, good and righteous people who believe in equality and justice for all, to admit that even we have gut reactions about people based on their race or gender or sexuality, that one is much harder to admit. But it's the truth. Every single one of us, no matter our own gender, our own skin color, our own political leanings, we are products of our culture. And we live in a society where masculinity is associated with strength and power and authority, where whiteness often equals goodness and intelligence, where wealth comes from morality and hard work, where Christianity is the norm. And none of us can live in this world without internalizing at least some of these ideas from time to time. And sometimes those ideas, lurking deep below the surface of our minds, sometimes they might even impact our actions. Yes, even ours. Back at my parents' synagogue again, there's a member there who grew up in Ethiopia until he was 10. When he was 10 years old, his rabbi gathered the community together and said, "Our people are coming to save us. Pack your suitcase and be ready to leave. In a few weeks, we will be together in Jerusalem." On Yom HaAtzmaut, he shared the story with our congregation of his experience being taken to Israel. And he told us that when the Israeli soldiers landed and rushed to help his family onto the plane that would take them to Israel, he was afraid and didn't want to go with them. They didn't look Jewish to him. He'd never seen a white Jew before. We all do it. We take our own experiences, the messages we receive from culture around us, we internalize it, we make it our own. And even when we can rationally and logically say, not all Jewish people look like me, sometimes in our kishkes, we actually think they do. Wishing Happy New Year to someone who looks Jewish but isn't, it's a split-second action you take without thinking about it based on that internal bias. And it may be harmless. But those split-second decisions based on gut reactions, they aren't always. Those little comments and looks, over time, they add up. And sometimes, those gut reactions, based on a lifetime of very quiet and subtle messaging, sometimes they cause a well-meaning person to fire a gun and take another's life. According to the Bible, when one sins, it fractures relationships with yourself, your community, and God. To correct the imbalance created by these fractured relationships, one was to make a ritual sacrifice. Once a year, on the 10th day of the 7th month, on a day in which we refrain from work and are required to fast, the priests made offerings on behalf of themselves, their family, and the community. Now, there are a variety of animal sacrifices required in the ancient world. Some you give to celebrate and thank God. Others you offer when something goes wrong. But the sacrifices the ancients required for Yom Kippur, that sacrifice was a chatat offering, a sin offering. And when we compare the chatat to other types of sacrifices, we see that it was required for sins we were aware of having committed. This specific sacrifice demanded recognition and self-awareness, and making it constituted a formal and public admission of the sin. Maimonides goes as far as to argue that the animal sacrifice itself wouldn't have counted as a sin offering until the sinner themselves had made a verbal confession. We no longer make animal sacrifices for our sins, but we are required to face them in a different way. In a few minutes, we'll say the Vidui, our confession, and we'll list our sins in alphabetical order. Hashem knew, but God knew. We'll say the Alchet together, and we'll apologize to God for the sins we have committed, the ways we have wronged God through our words and our actions, and this will replace our sacrifice. Our tradition teaches that these confessions will help us to turn from our wrongdoings so that we can do better in the year to come. We do this so God will forgive us, but that's not the only reason why. Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik explains that if one wishes to grow from sin and to reach the highest category of humanity, one cannot forget sin or tear out or erase the pages of iniquity from his book of life. Sins of the past, according to Soloveitchik, become a driving force toward the future. If we have missed the mark, committed sin, but don't acknowledge it, admit it, confront it in some way, we can all too easily ignore our own transgressions, pretending that they don't exist, rather than using them to propel ourselves forward. And if we don't admit that we have missed the mark, by what authority can we hold others accountable for theirs? In this room, we who are so committed to equality and justice, we in this room who are quick to speak out against racism and misogyny and phobias of all kind, let us admit tonight that it's easy to call out anti-Semitism when it's a swastika spray-painted on the side of a Jewish communal building. It's easy to rally against misogyny when it looks like Harvey Weinstein's disgusting actions towards women. It's easy to stand up to racism when it looks like a neo-Nazi using slurs. It's easy when the actions are obvious and loud and clear. And sometimes they are very loud and very clear. But sometimes it's so soft and quiet, we don't even recognize it at all. Sometimes the words that sting and the actions that prevent us from truly reaching equality and justice are subtle and much more gray than black and white. And sometimes the words that hurt and the actions that perpetuate the inequality in our world, sometimes they come even from good people with positive intentions. Sometimes they even come from people just like us. If we want to do better, we have to continue to do the good we already do, supporting justice and equality with our time and our money, speaking out against the harm we see in the world with our voices and our votes, and that will go a long way. But also, if we want to do better, if we want to be better, if we want to make the world better, we have to look deep inside ourselves as well. Look inside and admit that we are good and righteous people who make mistakes, who sometimes think and act differently than the values at our core, so that we can grow and change from them, so that we can achieve teshuvah. In the spirit of this season, on the eve of Yom Kippur, I stand before you and I admit that I too carry biases about race and gender, religion and class. I admit to you that these internal biases impact my actions despite my very best intentions. There have been times I did and said the wrong thing, times when I failed to see the wrongs done to others, times I failed to address the wrongs I saw. In the spirit of confession, in the spirit of this holiday, I begin with me, and I invite you to look inside as well.